Well, Kate Carnell, thank you so much for being involved in this series of discussions about post-corona and how we get our economy moving again. In your role as the advocate for small businesses across this country, I'm sure you've got a lot to say. So, you know, if we've got time, we could talk about training and we could talk about the environment, stuff like that. But why don't we get into the nuts and bolts of your role and what you'd like to see in terms of reform opportunities?
Well, Campbell, the first thing that's really important here is that small business, you know, how important is small business to our economy more broadly? Now, we hear politicians, as you and I probably said in the day, that small business was the engine room of the economy, all those things, which are just words, really. What we've got to do coming out of the end of this crisis is have policy settings that actually work for that engine room as we're talking about, as we talk about small business. Now, remember, 99% of businesses turn over under 10 million, which is the ATO definition of small business. 97% of businesses have less than 20 employees. So this is the vast percentage of businesses in Australia. You know, if small businesses employed one more person, those that employ, we wouldn't have unemployment at the other end of this. So if we're going to encourage small businesses to employ at the other end of this, we are a long way down the track to getting people back into employment. And of course, getting people back into employment is absolutely central to getting the economy moving again. So so from my perspective, I focus on it that way, on this whole approach of post-COVID-19 economy. So what do we need in our economy to encourage small businesses to employ at the other end of this? Well, you know, the first thing that small businesses need is business. You know, I know that's silly, but it's absolutely true. So, you know, state governments and federal governments spend $11 billion a year on procurement. How many governments actually really get it right with regard to ensuring that a goodly percentage of that procurement actually does go to Australian SMEs? You know, because as you and I know, the dilemma here is public servants are really good at giving big companies, IBM, you know, those sort of guys, you know, contracts, and they're really bad at giving small businesses or small to medium businesses a go.
And if I could just echo, or cut in for a sec on that, I mean, I've had personal experience with small businesses and startup enterprises trying to sell to state governments and local government subsequent to being a politician, and I have found it absolutely appalling. I mean, you die of starvation waiting for them to make a decision. The processes are long and unwieldy. How do we get the message across that they've got to change the processes for small business?
I think it's part of this whole, you know, the economy post-COVID. It's no more difficult than saying, okay, we've got to get the Australian economy moving. That means we've got to get Australian businesses employing in Australia. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to make sure it's not going to be a choice anymore. We are going to ensure that small businesses in Australia do get the work from federal, state and local governments. It won't be that, no public servant ever got, you know, sacked for giving IBM a contract, even though, as much as I love them, they're usually over budget and, you know, over time and all the rest of it. We've got to say we are going to take, I don't think it is a big risk, but the risk of, you know, companies like yours, you know, the very large percentage, you know, the 2.3 million small businesses in this country, we're going to take a bit of risk and we're going to give them the work. With the work comes employment. It's not about grants. It's not about handouts. It's about making it clear that it's not a choice. If we want jobs in Australia, we're going to do this. That means that the things that governments are going to have to do is get over the fact that you know, that, oh, it's really difficult dealing with smaller businesses, you know, we like to have really big contracts, you know, not smaller ones. Well, you know, this, you know, we've got a challenge going down the path here, and that's getting the economy moving. We'll get the economy moving if we get small businesses a chunk of this work, and give them the opportunity to show just how good they are. And so for me, first thing is let's fundamentally change the approach to procurement in Australia. Let's make it absolutely clear that governments at all levels must contract with Australian companies, Australian SMEs, and let's give innovation a big tick. You know, I think in public service terms, innovation equals risk. Innovation actually equals growth.
Yeah.
And this is something that's inside our control. You know, it's not some dramatic thing out there. We could do this, and we've got to, you know, this is a crisis. We need to get the economy moving. So let's do that. Let's get procurement actually happening. Infrastructure, you know, governments all talk about infrastructure. We've got a lot of infrastructure happening around Australia at the moment. A very large percentage of that infrastructure is going to multinationals. And I'm not saying that's, so mid-tier Australian firms that could actually do this work get left out all the time, because it's so much easier to go to the tier ones and so on. So let's give mid-tier Australian companies a fair go in the construction infrastructure space, you know, and get rid of the view that they're a bit risky. Well, I'm not sure that they are. And let's make sure that in all of our contracts, whether they, you know, be the very large amount of money we're spending in defence, or, you know, in various forms of infrastructure around federal and state governments, that it is actually required for the primes or the mid-tiers to contract locally, to contract to small businesses in their local area, and importantly, Campbell, pay them quickly and pay them on time. You know, my office spends a lot of time on the payment time issue, and one of the things that's horrified me is that how many big businesses, you know, we're talking, you know, large operations, have used COVID as a method of blowing out payment times.
Oh, look, Kate, I'm on the edge of a conflict of interest here, but I would echo exactly what you're saying. We're seeing quite unethical practices by very large ASX companies in the commercial property space at the moment, and you know, wanting rent reductions or rent waivers on commercial properties that with the landlords a lot smaller. So I think this would be a good thing, actually. I think the Prime Minister and the Premiers need to be taking a bit of a stand on this and saying it's just not on, and it flows through to other areas of procurement. I mean, leasing a property is just another area of procurement, and I see that now.
Well, you know, we want to encourage commercial landlords who are small to mediums, who are, to actually grow their portfolio. So we want them to get a fair go, and what we don't want is the scenario that happens in Australia is that, and that's the big multinationals and, the group of companies that they own and sit underneath them in Australia, to use this sort of situation, to screw the littler guys, which we are seeing. Now, when we talk about getting rid of red tape and focusing on productivity, these are actually doable things, that can actually, in my view, happen, in Australia. The other thing, and you've spoken a bit about education. What small to medium businesses are saying is, we want micro-credentialing, please. Can we actually have, skills training that actually fits our businesses? Doesn't fit the person who's running the trainings business, but fits our business. So if I happen to be, a small or a medium-sized business in rural New South Wales or Queensland, And I've got a real skills gap. I can't get people with a certain level of skills. We've got to have a system that is willing to work with that small business and deliver what they need. Now, because we've been running online now, we're getting better at online delivery. I think we can do that. The problem is it's usually the other way around. Here's a list of courses that we provide, and small businesses are saying, but we don't need any of them. But what we don't have is we need somebody. I'll give you an example. Okay, we had an abattoir who's doing really well, so they're not bad, but they're in a regional area, and they needed skill sets that ran across logistics, health, and what was the other thing? Anyway, there was a number of things that they needed, but what all that existed was a long course for logistics and a long course for maintenance of health outcomes in abattoirs and so on. What they wanted was a course that had elements of I think there was 3 or 4 things they wanted inside one course.
So what was the obstacle to provide that then? I mean, how...
lack of interest.
Hmm.
I mean, so the problem is the view was, oh, you're only, one provider. They had, how many staff they got? They probably got 50, but they don't have 500. And so the view was that we don't tailor for individuals, which is really stupid.
Mm.
And there's nothing to stop it happening, because they've got the modules. It's just about saying we are willing to put the modules that you need together in a training package, and we're willing to work with you on how you want it delivered.
So is that a private sector training provider problem, or is it a TAFE sort of government still mired in the practices of former years problem?
I think it's TAFE, absolutely. In this case, it was a TAFE issue. I think the private sector is doing better, but they can do lots better than they've done in the past. And I think that, what sits around our education approach is things like, well, you need a Cert 3 or a Cert 4 or whatever, and the question is, so why? Why do we need one of those? And why can't, if that's what we need, and it'll be because it's written into some piece of legislation somewhere that, that in terms of your health officer, in the abattoir, they've got to have a cert, whatever it might be. And to do a cert, whatever it might be, you've got to have done this bit over here, which isn't actually, it doesn't mean anything on the floor of the business at all, but it says it in the requirements to run your business. I know this is sounding a bit waffly, but quite seriously, it's the focus on what the business needs, what the skill sets the business needs, because if they can train people up for the skills they need, they can employ people, they can employ more people.
So let me throw it back at you then. The elements here are training, that whether it be the private sector providers or the TAFE system, they have to refocus to actually really look at what the businesses want, but also the politicians and the senior bureaucrats really have to dive down into pieces of legislation and make sure there aren't sort of legislative roadblocks or almost sort of mechanisms that are forcing people to go in an inappropriate direction.
That's absolutely true. And normally what happens now is you say, oh, we can't do that because the legislation says, or the regulation says, it's got to be a Cert 3 or a Cert 4. And to get a Cert 3 or a Cert 4, there are requirements for Cert 3 or Cert 4, which sit over here in this other piece of legislation. So we can't do this tailored package over here because it's not going to work.
Well, Kate, why don't we talk about schools and how they're preparing young people? I have a personal view. I think the schools are a bit out of touch with the technological developments and sort of learning to use an iPad or even a laptop. I don't think that's not technical education. That's not learning you to be a coder or someone who's going to be in technological startups, I think that's just using a device. What do you think?
Look, I think schools are way behind the curve on this. And, when you think about it, school counsellors that tell people, what they could look at it from a career perspective, on the whole, are teachers that are looking at working part-time in the teaching space. They don't want to do as much face-to-face teaching, and they want to do some counselling. That's great. But do they actually know what's happening in the technology arena? Do they actually know what the marketplace looks like, or what jobs are needed, skills are needed in an area, in a regional area?
So how do we address that? How do we change that situation? Because I think you're dead right, sadly.
Well, we don't need kids to be said or to be told, oh, you're bright and you are, you're good at arts, but you're not much good at science. So, you should do law. You do law, and if you're good at science, then, or if you're really bright, you could be a doctor, or you could, all those traditional sort of things. Now I'm a pharmacist, so that's it's a good thing to do. But there's so many other options now, and the growth areas are not those traditional courses that you and I did or were done in those spaces. So what do I think we should do? I think we should require our schools to bring in representatives of the business community, the local business community, the local Chamber of Commerce, people who can come in and talk about the jobs that are available in an area, the sort of skills that businesses are looking for, and having some of those bright, smart young people who are putting together startups, who are doing really clever things, and talking about the skills you need to run a business. What does entrepreneurship actually look like? And if you get the right, and you can, those fantastic young people who are doing this, their capacity to speak to other young people in the school system, I think is the way to go, to enthuse them.
Well, we're actually going to talk to a very inspirational young man in a subsequent part of this series of videos, by the way, a former Australian of the Year for Queensland. But I won't sort of give any more of that sneak preview. But look, do you think though we've got past this thing where I think it was a real problem in the 90s? You sort of alluded to it, where we said, "Oh, you got to go to uni." That was the secret of success. I mean, I used to joke, and my daughters have put up with this for a long time, but I used to joke that I hope my daughter becomes a plumber or marries a plumber, because I really think that was a great place to be. So are we dealing with that? We've still got a problem there?
Look, we haven't dealt with it at all. A good thing is we've started to get politicians say it, say it publicly. Well, you're saying it publicly, but what we're actually doing in our schools is still saying, oh, well, you're bright, you're good at this, so you go to uni, so a sort of a perception that it's based upon school-based results. The ones at the top go to uni, the next ones might do something else, and so on. But that's just silly. I mean, there's no logic to that at all. In fact, as you talk about plumbers, probably the most successful business person I know, certainly in terms of how much he's grown his business or his empire and his wealth, is a plumber.
I was indeed thinking of that. I've got many of my own observations and case studies on people like that, that's for sure. But look, can we, given we're a bit limited for time, why don't we move back to this whole issue of regulation? And I mean, I think there's an enormous amount that can be done in this space. Running a small business myself, a funds management business where we invest in commercial property, we have to deal with a variety of government agencies, federal agencies and also state ones. And I would love to require federal ministers to sit beside small business owners and actually see firsthand how some of this technology doesn't work properly at the coalface. So there's one agency, for example, we're required to register with. We have very strict requirements and huge penalties if we don't get it right. It took us recently, because we were changing the way the business was set up, it took us 3 hours over 3 weeks to try and fulfil our obligations to be registered. The MyGov ID thing, constantly I hear from businesses, what is this thing? And Kate, why do they call it MyGov ID when there's already a MyGov? That confuses the living daylights out of people. So there's a whole lot there for you. What do you reckon?
It was a political decision, I'm told, because the ATO agrees with you that it's a really bad name. Look, I think we should be able to have a scenario where we have an experience like that. As small business people, we should have a one place to go that says this doesn't work, and the requirement is to fix it. So we hear it all the time of really clunky systems that really mess up productivity. Because think of all that time you spent that you could have been doing something that was productive, which is, a real issue. So, but while we continue to say, oh, well, it really causes me a problem, MyGov ID, real issue, dumb name, hard to know the difference, but we don't do anything about it. We just say, oh, well, this is what it is. I think we've got to just change that. And as part of post-COVID, a productive Australia. And just while we're talking about too much red tape, there's something called the Fair Work Act. Now, it's 960 sections, 250,000 words, and that's before we get to the 122 awards that exist in the industrial relations space. Australia is the only country in the world with an award system. We are unique. New Zealand to some extent, but they deregulated their workforce a while ago, so you can't count them. So we've got the most complicated system you could ever imagine, and it's the same system whether you've got 5 employees or 500 employees. If we want small businesses to employ, we've got to have a system that makes it easier for them to employ, easy for them to unemploy if something doesn't work, and importantly, a scenario where they can work with their employees for the way they work, the hours they work, whatever, to suit both the employee and the employer. We think we need a small business award, something that works for small business, that gets rid of a lot of the red tape, the mess generally. If we can't fix up the system more broadly, let's fix it for small businesses.
Well, I really, really like what you're saying, and I would hope in this time and in the months to come that we could try and get some trust going here, because the union movement and I have been fairly big foes in the past, and they don't trust me. But I would say most sincerely on this that I actually respect their role in terms of protecting workers, and they've got a proud history of doing that. And frankly, I've seen in this crisis big business do some odious things, and I've referred to that already. And so, for absolutely there needs to be protections for workers. But I would hope that maybe the union movement could understand and be prepared to enter into some really good discussions about how we could protect workers, but do exactly what you've just said. It's so vital, and I think, Kate, that at the moment, if we could just somehow impart to people in the union movement that really the effects of this are going to be, if it's not changed, they're actually going to inhibit employment. I mean, it is really daunting. As a small business person. I actually have an employee in my business, a young man, a graduate, and it was quite a big step for me. With all my experience and over the years, and it was a big decision to employ that one person. And I'm so glad I did, but I'm also conscious of the responsibilities to get it right. And we hear a lot about wage theft, and I'm disappointed with that phrase, because I don't think that businesses usually set out to rob their employees, particularly, and I'll say it because it's in the public record, organisations like Coles. The idea of trying to rip off the workers and then the reputational damage they've suffered, it's implausible in my mind. The system has to be changed. And I'd hope coalition frontbenchers would stop using the term, because it's silly. They should be saying we need to fix the system.
And look, you've got entities like the ABC having a significant problem with, the ABC, whatever we think about them, they didn't set out to underpay their staff.
No way.
They just didn't. But they did. even with an HR section and even with all of the bells and whistles they've got. So if Coles and the ABC and lots of big companies can't get it right, how are we expecting that 97% of small businesses with under 20 employees, with exactly the same requirements, exactly the same act and all the rest of it, to get it right? It's too complex. It's that simple. So we've got to find a way for it not to be, and at the same time work with the unions on this. It's almost back to the Hawke-Keating era of the Accord, where there was an interest in sitting down together and saying, we're not going to get the economy going. We're not going to get the reforms we need, without a bit of give and take.
Well, I like that. That's a new Accord. That's one for the PM and the National Cabinet. Why don't I try this on you? And this might be a bit provocative for you in your role. When I was Premier, I used to have a business forum, and I used to bring these people together on a quarterly basis for a lunch or a breakfast, and we'd talk about issues. And time again, I would, when I got complaints about red tape, I'd say, look, well, here's a government that will fix it. You tell us, we'll make the case. And you know what? I've actually got to say that I was disappointed that I didn't get the really meaty stuff. And I think that's a challenge for business to stand up. Stop whinging in the background. So I've had a bit of a whinge in this discussion, but stop whinging and actually put on the table the meaty, specific things that have to be changed.
I absolutely agree, because like you, I became Chief Minister and said, I'm going to get rid of the red tape. I'm going to have less legislation, not more. Do you think I succeeded? No. Tried really hard, but the dilemma is that you just don't get the feedback from business generally, whether they be small or large. I think a lot of the problem is that red tape is cumulative. Like, a bit on its own doesn't look like a lot, but when you put them all together, it is a lot. And I think we've got to focus on the bits that don't look that big. But if we keep looking at the bits and get rid of them and fix them, then we'll do something constructive about red tape and the huge cost to the economy. And let's be fair, a lot of red tape is to avoid risk. That's what it's for. A lot of it is because something happened, so we've got to do something to stop it happening again. I think we've got to get over that and accept that, that impacts productivity significantly.
Well, you've just reminded me of something else I'd like to put to you. I've been quite concerned that in recent years the rhetoric of politicians is quite contradictory. On the one hand, we will hear people saying, have a go, set up a business, take a risk, have a punt, this is a country that rewards that sort of stuff, employ people. But then it could be on the same news broadcast that night, you have a politician sort of almost waving the fist going, that enterprise sort of has hurt that worker, or God forbid, someone's died. We're going to put people away. Company directors need more personal responsibility placed on them. The corporate veil needs to be swept aside so we hold these shonky businesses to account. I think more the latter is the message, and again, it's scaring people from having a go. And I think the political class and the very senior bureaucrats need to be mindful of what they're doing in creating the wrong sort of culture.
Campbell, I'll give you a really good example right now. Legislation is being put forward in South Australia, which fundamentally makes it the responsibility of the employer if somebody gets COVID-19 while they're on their staff. So you have to, it is deemed in this legislation that they got it at work unless you can prove they didn't.
That's ridiculous.
No, I know it's ridiculous.
And it's a Liberal government. What is Steve
And it's a Liberal government. It's one of those things that's being pushed by WorkSafe Australia that, it's absolutely true. As an employer, I have to, make sure that my workplace is safe. But there's certain things I just can't do. I mean, I couldn't know if somebody caught, COVID-19 at work or not, if I put in place all the requirements, social distancing, cleaning, all that stuff. That should be what I'm required to do. Make sure I've got a safe workplace. And then I shouldn't be responsible if somebody on my staff gets it. But, there you go.
I hope business in South Australia is pushing back hard on that one, because
they are.
That's ridiculous.
I'm just horrified that anybody, and I have to say, what WorkSafe Australia Safe Work Australia seems to believe it's a good thing too. And already the Fair Work Commission has said anyone who gets COVID-19 will get 2 weeks unpaid leave. Now that's absolutely fine. I get that, but so far, all of these things, you put them all together, including workers' comp, that if you catch COVID at work, you'll be able to get workers' comp. And, you put all these things together in our current environment, and you would then wonder why businesses say, actually, it's just too hard.
Too hard, absolutely, yeah.
Well, here's another one then that I think we need to cover as well, and it's the disparity between the states. So I'll put my hand up here. Here's something that perhaps I walked into and should have been far more, critical of. Like in Queensland, you've got to have an auctioneer's licence. You got to do a course, pay a fee. It's all about risk again, as you said before. Whereas other states you don't have to. And I'm not suggesting for a moment, I'm a great believer in not actually having this totally harmonised, homogenised national system, because I think it's good to have competition between the states and territories. But there really are some real disparities that don't make a lot of sense and affect business. I mean, and this is in the age of the internet, where people can be conducting an auction which is based with a company that's based, I don't know, in the Virgin Islands or something. Sort of.
That's true. So, Campbell, between you and I, ACT, Queensland, how come we couldn't even get consistent national transport rules? So if you're driving a big truck from Perth to Brisbane, you're going to run through a whole lot of states that are going to have different rules. Now, how dumb is that? There's even a scenario where, so you have to go to lowest common denominator. So, in terms of the amount of load you can have, what you can have on your truck. If we can't even solve that in terms of red tape, and we've got a national transport regulator, but still haven't managed to do it, we're just not trying hard enough, because that's not a competition issue. That's a productivity issue. Yes. And yet everybody, we have to take responsibility for this. Everyone says, well, yeah, we'd like something consistent, but we'd like it to be ours. So, we've got the best. So as long as everybody complies with this state or that state, we'll all be happy. Well, sorry, that doesn't help. And it won't achieve the productivity that we need going forward. We don't have the same labelling rules across state borders. And yet we obviously have to, because you're manufacturing a product. You don't want to have different rules for what you've got to have on the label in every state, and therefore have to put everything on the label to make sure that it complies. How dumb's that? But we still do it.
Yeah, we just all do it. And you mentioned that productivity word, and I was talking to Joel Fitzgibbon, obviously the prominent Labor Party frontbencher from the Hunter Valley, and he actually referred to the Productivity Commission, said, when we were having a chat the other day, he said, look, there's a lot of Productivity Commission reports sitting there gathering dust, and he was proposing pulling them out. He reckoned it was great work and we should be really getting into that.
Well, I absolutely agree. Let's pull out a number of the Productivity Commission reports, because there's great stuff in them, and let's pull out the Henry tax review.
Yes.
And because what Ken did is he looked at which taxes were good for productivity and which taxes were bad for productivity. Now, unfortunately, a chunk of the taxes we have are really bad for productivity, like payroll tax and, some stamp duties and all those things. Even income-based taxes only fit in the middle. We know which ones are good for productivity, and we know the ones that are an anchor. It would seem, if ever there was a chance to improve productivity and to fix our tax system, it's now, because we need the economy back on track.
Well, look, I've never thought I would be supporting a change to the GST, and I never did in the past, but given this crisis and again the opportunity for reform, like you've said, I'm saying quite publicly, I have been for a few weeks, I think the GST's got to go up to make it more. I think it should be more wide-ranging. That's a bit of a dangerous one politically, but the quid pro quos, the states have to get rid of some of those terrible taxes like payroll tax that you mentioned before. Yeah.
Well, remember that's what was supposed to happen back in the day, but we need to do it now. And you're right, a broad-based GST, like New Zealand has, many countries have, that's easier to administer because it's not on this and not on this and all sorts of things, and getting rid of taxes that are a lead weight on the economy or on productivity. It's what Ken did in the Henry Review back in the day. It's been said by various reviews over the years. It's patently obvious. And I don't think we're going to be able to address a range of productivity issues where we don't want to. I don't think any government wants to put up tax to pay back our huge debt that we're going to have at all sorts of levels of government. What we need is to drive productivity, have the economy actually buzzing, and we won't do that with anchors on it in all sorts of places.
Company tax, personal tax. Do you want to go out on a long creaky branch on one of those?
Oh, look, I think the real issue is they've got to be the same, because there can't be a good reason to structure your business around, you're going to be in the company tax space rather than personal. There's a whole lot of dumb stuff. And I'd back to small business for a moment. We'd be better with a lower rate and no deductions. So you want to go out on a limb, I've just done it. But, having lots of different deductions, lots of different, ups, downs and roundabouts, why don't we just have a lower rate and get rid of the reductions, particularly for small businesses, where it's really at the margin stuff, but it takes a lot of time and effort and, gets in the way of productivity and makes people structure their business in ways that aren't terribly logical.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of, I suppose, I don't know that a lot of smart people actually do get this in government, that the more rules you have, the more that people look for ways to get around those rules, and the more schemes and machinations and wasted energy, can we put it that way, that only feeds perhaps professional services companies, while they do a great job, of course.
Well, they do, but you don't want a scenario where we've got a whole industry helping people navigate systems that are too complex. Mm-hmm. That's not a value add, really.
And now businesses everywhere have been battered and smashed and are lying bloody on the mat, and we've got to give people an incentive to pick themselves up and carry on and rebuild. So hopefully we will stimulate that sort of interest. So thank you so much, Kate. Yeah, really appreciate your time.
Appreciate it too, Campbell. Thank you very much.